Welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We are a global non-profit organization dedicated to spreading education around artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and social change. In this podcast, we are hoping to provide insightful discussions with young professionals and world-leading researchers alike. I'm your host, Manuel Brenner, and now without any further ado, let's jump right in. We're recording, so hi everyone. I'm here with Leonard Bereska. Thanks a lot for joining us on the ACIT Science Podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll start with a short introduction on you and your background. You studied physics at Heidelberg University, and during your master's degree already started to venture into machine learning and computer vision applications. And since several years, you have worked on developing AI algorithms, mostly in a neuroscientific context, but also for more general, broader applications. And you've primarily worked on reconstructing nonlinear dynamical systems and are now doing your PhD at University of Amsterdam with applications in this direction, which we will definitely talk about in much more detail. There is quite a lot of overlap between what the both of us do professionally, and we've actually also worked together on a project last year, which just got published at ICML. So I hope we will have a lot of things to talk about also in that direction. On top, you are also a special guest since we have known each other for quite some time, and you are probably the person I had the most wide-ranging scientific discussion with in my entire life. So I hope we can carry some of that spirit of our conversations into this recording. So as an opening question, you are a physicist turned machine learner. Do you remember what originally sparked your interest in AI and made you transition more to this programming-based, machine learning-based research? And where do you see some similarities and useful background knowledge that you acquired in your physics studies?
First of all, let me thank you for being here. I feel very honored, especially in light of all the high-profile guests that have been on your podcast already. So my first interest in AI, I guess it was kind of in the general when the general machine learning revolution started, the applications of deep learning became very practical. That really, as for many others, sparked my interest. With connection to physics, I sometimes found a bit frustrating the particle physics world, and I thought it would be nice if, or I thought, okay, if in a couple of years a machine can do what I do here, then why not develop that machine instead?
Yeah, I think you could probably say that about not only physics, but about many other things. So like from a meta perspective, as a scientist, if you can develop an algorithm that becomes a meta scientist, then you developing that algorithm are doing much more research, basically. It's discounted.
I think we will see this in many fields, that kind of AI will merge into any field, any scientific field, and at the same point, all fields converge together to AI. That's at least my feeling at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely the hope and maybe the promise or the fear. I think we can talk a lot about that at a later point.
Yeah.
It's also interesting. I read this article actually today because LHC was turned on again, and I also originally did particle physics, and it's quite interesting that now so much hope relies on, can we find something at higher energies at LHC? I think that a lot of us felt that frustration during our master's degree when we ventured into particle physics and basically thought, what's the point of doing this theoretical or experimental work if we don't observe any new physics? And the Higgs boson had been predicted 60 years from now before, and if you don't see supersymmetry, if you don't see new particles, then basically the whole field is stagnating.
Yeah, it's we're kind of in a strange position there in physics, that we lack the energies maybe or maybe we got something fundamentally wrong, but it seems like we have a lot of different theories and very elaborate, but we don't, and we know that the standard model is incorrect, but it's still very good, and we don't observe anything that violates that.
Yeah. The thing with these high energies is that it's just becomes infeasible. Because even if you have somewhat linear scaling of energies with the size of the machine you have to build, you very quickly run into these very earthly constraints. I mean, LHC is already enormous and just gets crazy expensive, but you only get like 1 order of magnitude more energy, but potentially and up until these scales that you can imagine particles living in, it's like 15 orders of magnitude. So
yeah, that also reminds me a bit of. Do you remember the first when the LHC was first turned on? There was fears about black holes forming, and it kind of connects to the existential risk debate that we may venture on later in the podcast. That sometimes it's also questionable if we want to actually research certain things. Are you familiar with the Nick Bostrom? The black balls that you have a box and you draw balls out of it, and some balls are black and you don't know which ones in advance. But if you draw a black ball, then you destroy the whole everything. so that's a problem that usually you think of science as something that's universally good, but especially in the context of AI, I think we need to be a bit more careful sometimes. Maybe.
I mean, his claim with these black balls and the gray balls, I think, is quite convincing now that we are also seeing the Ukrainian invasion and kind of already seeing the threat of one person having the potential to blow up entire countries or even the entire world with nuclear weapons. And then you have to remember that we are basically in a pretty lucky position that we can actually still maintain some control over nuclear weapons, because only a limited amount of countries have it, and you need to have like a huge research program to do that. But if you think of I think the analogy he used is like, if you put a handful of sand into your microwave and it leads to a nuclear, like an explosion on the scale of Hiroshima, then we would be just completely fucked as a civilization.
Yeah, we're just also incredibly lucky that the atomic bomb itself didn't turn out to be destructive enough. And initially, there was quite a debate before the first launch of the atomic bomb, then that could lead to a cascade of basically blowing up the whole atmosphere. And physicists stayed up late in the night to readjust their calculations. And I mean, we are just lucky that it turns out to be fine to launch an atomic bomb. Like one single bomb is fine.
It could have been much worse.
But anyway, it's I think it's very relevant. It's kind of depressing, that topic, but it's highly relevant if we want to survive the next centuries.
Maybe we can still start with your research and more concrete research question before going into the very wide-ranging discussions. So you're working on kind of this dynamical systems angle and time series analysis angle with some neuroscience applications. Maybe we can just start there by discussing what dynamical systems actually are and why they are interesting both for the sciences and for machine learning applications.
Yeah, so first of all, my broad research topic is memory or long-term memory in AI. But so far I've been looking at dynamical systems almost exclusively because I like sequential data and I like generative models. And so dynamical systems are basically a dynamical system is a function defined in space that defines the time evolution of a state. So if you and that function stays constant. So at each point in time, you apply the same function, and then the question is, so what's the long-term behavior of if you apply a function over and over again recurrently? In the sciences, dynamical systems are ubiquitous. In physics, like neuroscience, you can treat everything as a dynamical systems. I think that's.
I think that's what physicists do.
Sometimes that may also be a too broad lens to look at things, but you can. Nature itself can be treated as a dynamical system. The climate, the brain. So that for the sciences, it's a very useful theory to look at.
Yeah, and I mean, even arguably Newtonian physics is based on that whole conception of, first of all, calculus with its infinitesimal approach to time is basically based on that conception of modeling motion in time, and that's a form of dynamics. And the simplest dynamical descriptions are also in physics, like based on the Hamiltonian Lagrangian formalisms. And even, the Schrödinger equation, in a sense, is also like a time evolution of the wave function. So it's also, in some sense, a dynamical description of the world. So it's, I guess it's very fundamental, and most of the things we observe in real life that happen in time are in some sense based on dynamical systems. Even as you say, it's sometimes not the most fruitful description, maybe. Like the stock market is not best modeled as a dynamic system, probably.
You would have to include every variable, and it's like super high dimensional, and includes us, essentially, our humans, interacting with it, and each individual brain, and so it can be too general of a description. But it's if you have a dynamical system, you're often interested in what's the limit behavior, what's the stable states of a system, if there's any. Is it a chaotic system? Does it have limit cycles? And that can be it's very, very relevant. Like for example, for climate change, I'm often thinking there's often this notion of runoff climate change, so that we cross a certain tipping point, and then things catastrophically change into a new stable, like find a new stable regime. And the question is where's the tipping points? Did we already cross them? Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, that's a point where that perspective of dynamical systems theory comes in handy, because again, our human intuitions in most regards are quite linear, and like a certain linear response leads to a certain linear outcome.
Yeah, that's the problem. Like if we linearly increase CO2, at some point there's a non-linear response. Like, but also maybe also, my hope is always with climate change that there's some sort of, it's kind of a pervert hope, because that there's some force of nature reducing CO2 by itself. By, for example, could be by catastrophes or heat waves that naturally would limit economic output of humans, of us, which would be catastrophic and like disaster for us, but would limit the CO2 emissions, and could be the only way that nature readjusts.
The problem from an evolutionary perspective is that there's really no incentive for nature to have developed these kind of
No. I don't mean it. I don't mean nature like a Gaia hypothesis. Although I love that image, but I don't want to romanticize nature here. It's just, is the physics of the Earth like that, or is it not like that? That's the question. And it may be that it's like maybe like drying out the southern hemisphere leads to human society changing in ways that would recalibrate. We are also part of nature in that image.
That's just wanted to say that the thing evolution actually brought forth that can counter climate change is human beings. But the greatest at it. But referring back to the Clean Air Task Force episodes we recorded, there is some hope, and there's some people working on it.
Very smart people. It's a very like everybody in the world, almost everybody is aware of climate change. So there's a lot of hope. I just don't want to sound too gloomy here, but we also actually have to do it. It's not like it's gonna come by itself, except for these. Maybe there's some force by itself that destroys so much of humanity that by itself becomes better.
Not to sound too gloomy.
To
connect that back to the dynamical systems perspective. I think it's quite relevant, and also why that perspective on climate models, for example, is so important, because I think it's essentially not about predicting linear responses by a simplified model, which is like, I think, a general problem in the social sciences, also in economics, when you have simplified models that don't manage to capture the underlying interesting phenomena, which are mostly nonlinear tipping points, bifurcations, and then they are actually telling you what you are really interested in. For example, in climate change, how much time do we actually have? And we have all of these reports and all of the science that is actually leading to policy decisions that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, but they are based on models which are essentially dynamical systems models of the climate. So again, to stress that point, that it's a pretty relevant
it's a cornerstone of the science there. I mean, also like what we both worked on mostly is like in the context of mental health. You treat the brain as a dynamical system, and there it's interesting to see what's for example the bifurcations between what we consider a healthy individual and mental disease. So that may be also different dynamical regimes of the brain. And then maybe you can find from brain recordings, as we did in the paper, you can find these like fixed points, for example, and analyze their stability and connect that to certain mental conditions.
And there's the underlying hypothesis that most mental functions are in some way also implemented in terms of dynamics, because we don't have like a Turing machine in our brain, but we have a dynamical brain, which is firing away very merrily most of the time.
Yeah, so for example, memory could be like attractor states there, like like this. There's this Hopfield network as a system proposed in neuroscience, where you can store memories as attractor states, and when you have certain input that resembles the memory, then there's an auto-associative recall of that memory.
Yeah, maybe now that we talk about Hopfield networks, can we go into that in a bit more detail? Because I think it illustrates, like, now that you're also working on memory, some of the basic principles quite nicely.
Yeah, so Hopfield networks is so originally is like a discrete binary network. So there's like the network state is each dimension of the network can be either 1 or -1, and you want to store patterns, which are then abstract vectors of ones and -1s, and you store them. Maybe the mathematical details I can spare, but you can construct from the memories itself. You can construct the network, and by showing an arbitrary the network like that, partial noise corrupted memory, then it's able to, as a dynamical system, as a matter of fact, over multiple iterations, mostly also maybe it was only one, but it can be also many iterations, converge to that attractor state and retrieve the memory that's been stored.
Just putting that into analogy with our brain, when we I think there's this basic assumption that our memories are also high dimensional or multidimensional, composed out of multiple sensory inputs. So if we remember like our living room at home, we remember smells and we remember sights and sounds. And if we observe something, or maybe even more trivially, or like if we see a face that looks similar to the face of a person that we know, then that memory gets activated, which is also stored kind of dynamically somewhere in the activations in our brain, and then we can it really brings a certain person into focus, and then we can think about that person as well.
Yeah, I find that quite interesting. It often occurs that you want to remember a name of a person and you forgot how that person is called, and then for me it always helps to just think of like more situations where I would have encountered that person, and make the input that leads to this auto-associative or hetero-associative recall in that case, and then if you think more about it, then at some point it comes back out of nowhere. You don't really do anything, but it just pops in, and somehow in that image somehow the state has converged to this attractor that you've been searching for.
And my favorite image from world literature is the beginning of Marcel Proust's Recherche, where he's eating that Madeleine as a grown man, and that brings him back to the memory of his grandma's place in his childhood, and that basically starts off the entire 7-book marathon of that of that work. And it's perfectly encapsulates that associative memory, which I think for human beings is especially pronounced with smells or with the olfactory system, because that somehow kind of gets sensory information right into parts of our brain where we have like long-term memory, for example, and can activate certain areas that are hard to access otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, smells are so distinct. They're like extremely high dimensional and very distinct, and connected. That's true. They can be very deeply connected to memory that you don't even know that you have. Like you can't even recall that memory otherwise if you don't have the smell. That could be. Yeah.
I mean, that's so interesting how the brain organizes basically how searchable it is. In a computer, we have an address for everything, and then usually, I mean, you can still lose stuff on your computer by having a inefficient, stupid file names or something. But in principle, everything is stored in one concrete location. You can always look it up.
Yeah, although in a sense, I mean, that makes it more robust, but it's the brain is more distributed, and also that's why it fades. Like how you forget things is also not in the same way as a computer would do it, to just delete the file and then it's gone. And I mean, okay, maybe there's like some copy of it in a cage and so on, and you can retrieve it somehow. But I mean, these are technicalities. But in principle, if you delete it, it's gone completely. And in the brain, it's way more gradual. Like you can forget things, and then by some like very intense stimulus, you can remember it even. Or maybe if you learn a language and then forget it, then if you learn it the second time, it's much easier to learn, much faster.
And the other interesting thing about memory in the human brain is that it's basically has the prioritization of how important a memory is inbuilt from the get-go. And you have these Ebbinghaus forgetting curves that from the 19th century, which I think were determined now to be actually kind of the information theoretic optimum for like prioritizing the information contained in it. So forgetting is in itself optimal. It's not like, oh, we are so stupid human beings.
How in which sense optimal?
In the sense of kind of filtering out like which information you actually need, because
and under the assumption of like a bounded capacity or something, and
like how searchable the space is. I mean, it also connects to the other question of if you have a computer and if you don't know where information is, it has to be searchable in a certain way, and then you have certain mathematical bounds on like how fast a bubble sort can.
Or maybe it's connected to this least recently used algorithm, right? Like that. I mean, that you also have this in computer science. It's the optimal way. If you don't know anything else, the optimal way to search for something is to just use the thing that you used the last time. So then these Ebbinghaus forgetting curves would basically make that happen, right? That you still remember something if it just recently encountered and forget it otherwise.
Yeah. And I mean, from that, you get the spaced repetition principle of repeating it after a couple of hours, the next day, next week. And then.
Yeah, I mean, humans have several mechanisms of memory, right? Like you can also remember something that you just encounter once. And not, I mean, repetition always works. You can always remember something by repeating it a lot of times. And that makes sense also, and connects it to machine learning, where you have like these updates and gradient updates, and just have to have a lot of repetition to store it. But humans can also learn by just if something is really stressful. Like if you have a really stressful experience, you will not forget that. I mean, sometimes it's also like connected to mental health, but that can be very detrimental for certain people if you have like a traumatic experience and cannot properly process that.
And memory is also stored on several layers in the brain. Even with PTSD, for example, you have this embodiment aspect of it, that it's really, there's this great book, The Body Keeps the Score, that talks about PTSD. And also you, like in terms of anxiety and panic attacks, you have basically the cortical pathway, which has access to your abstract representations of these memories that you can usually access pretty easily, but the amygdala itself keeps memory of the emotional association of that traumatic event. And then you can get panic attacks by smelling a certain smell that you smelled in a traumatic experience, which you can't even remember is connected to that, but you just get anxious instantly.
Yeah, no. And that's connected because of stress. There's also like research on like when you, for example, when is the optimal time to drink the coffee if you want to learn something. Then like Huberman talked about this in his podcast. Yeah. You actually have to drink it after, like shortly after you learn something, because that increases cortisol and like stress. I mean, coffee makes you stressed essentially, among other things, and then you remember it better.
Yeah, but that ties in nicely with this, like this idea that the body, we don't remember anything just for fun.
No,
because it's fun to remember enough. Everything follows some kind of prioritization, hierarchization of, do we need this information? Then we modulate it by attention and by neurotransmitters that also get activated on larger time scales when it comes to focusing on certain life situations, on some kind of information. Acetylcholine as well, when you have these like strong traumatic experiences, then that basically consolidates all the impressions you have in the couple of hours around that event.
Yeah, I mean, and also like that's why memory is not really a faithful account of the past. It's always useful for the future, and maybe even like false. You can wrongly remember something, and in case of humans, memory is not worth anything by itself, evolutionarily speaking. It's only to act better in the past.
Yeah, that's in the hippocampus. That's also this cool perspective that future is basically like the past, but like flipped around. So projecting the past into the future.
Yeah, there's the sequences, and there's replay sequences and reverse replay and as a future projection.
Yeah. If in rat experiments, you could actually see that pretty distinctly in the hippocampus, that you have these sequences that get just turned around in order when they are thinking about the future.
Yeah, and in a sense, you can like planning, you can view as just remembering the future, kind of.
Yeah, and that illustrates that it's such a dynamical endeavor, and that so many, that basically not a fixed past that you can just access, but every recall, in a way, again talking about this repetition aspect, every recall you have on the prefrontal cortex basically updates your memories to the current state of the world, and trying to integrate it into our world model. Then we have something like cognitive dissonance. If you have a memory that doesn't really suit your current world model, then either you recall it and adjust it to your vision of the world, or you just ignore it. So there are many tricky things that we don't really face in AI.
Yeah. Many of these biases are kind of very human, and let's hope we can overcome them in AI.
Yeah, or maybe we don't build them in from the get-go. Maybe that's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, I mean, biases in AI, that's a huge topic. And I mean, all the biases in AI come from the data, I would say. Like if the data is already like biased in some way, then you have that's a problem with only data, learning from data, that you can, if you employ those systems then to predict the future, then maybe it's just like predicting based on some stereotypes of the past and propagating stereotypes.
Yeah, but that's like biases in a more limited sense, because I can actually the algorithm itself doesn't really give anything to it that additionally biases it, I would say. So it just basically captures the underlying structure of the data it is given.
It's kind of, I mean, it's, if you treat the data as the reality, then it's just a statistical reality of how the world is. But I mean, if you, of course, then you have to be really careful about your data if you make that assumption.
Yeah, but in a way, some of human cognitive biases are also the kind of skewed representations of the statistics of the world, because they are kind of over-inferring. Maybe we can also connect that to the point you mentioned earlier about machine learning mostly relying on repetition and not being able to do this one-shot learning, or like doing learning on few examples.
What do you mean?
So machine learning, you usually need a lot of data to basically capture the underlying statistical distribution, and human beings can infer models or realities from one example. You have one-shot learning or a couple of examples, but that induces in principle more biases because you don't have a proper representation of the diversity of reality. For example, if you see one dog and say, that's a dog, and then you won't realize there's like hundreds of different brands of dogs out there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see my point?
Not really, to be honest. Is it like it's not connected to the left-right hemispherical divide or anything? Okay, no.
No, it's mostly like a statistical claim that I think biases come from like incomplete perceptions of the given reality.
Yeah.
And human brains are more prone to biases because they over-infer on small amounts of data. I mean, this is also a strength of the human brain.
They also have to do this. It's kind of also like connected to Bayesian inference, right? We have you can say biases that are basically our priors, and a basic prior for humans is everything foreign is bad, and like everything that's different from me is bad. Could be like any characteristic, like and you can even divide like humans into red and blue teams randomly, and then you would be more hostile to the other team. And I mean, this is like a very, very basic like tribal tendency that we have, and that has to have been useful in the past, but now we have a lot of problems with it.
There was this in the chariot racing in Constantinople back in the day. You also had this blue and the green faction, and they were all from the same city, and it was just basically two colors completely made up and not related to anything. And then they also had there was this huge fight between both factions where thousands of people died. So
and I mean, the mod is kind of the ancient day hooligan phenomenon. I mean, nowadays we have football teams are also completely arbitrary, and
I mean, at least you can make the claim that it's connected to the city you're from or something, and some kind of local traditions. But of course, I just find it even more hilarious or like horrifying. Depends what you say. If it's just two colors and they are completely arbitrary, they don't have anything to do, and it's just dudes racing on chariots, then people start fighting.
Yeah. Well, I'm not concerned that this type of problems we won't have with AI. I think unless we build it in specifically. But we will have other types of problems where we would actually want human priors or human constructs of, for example, moral values or something that we perceive as totally natural, that are missing in our AI by default.
Yeah.
In that sense, AI can be like, if it's just goal maximizing, then it's kind of like has psychopathic tendencies that it doesn't, if it's not constrained by anything else.
Yeah, but it's an interesting question, like which of the priors, of the human priors you want to build in, because it seems like that's one of the central next steps in building machine learning or effective AI models, is to have more priors inbuilt to capture certain structures of reality, or like kind of have the ability of the algorithm to already react efficiently to, for example, the physics of the world, or learning more efficiently from data without seeing millions of samples. But probably we invite a lot of unwanted things into our algorithms if we formulate too strong prior.
Yeah. Yeah, it depends on the situation. I think it's very hard to make general statements there.
Yeah.
But I mean, like from this, I mean, if we want to touch on AI safety, from a safety perspective, you would want, some sort of control, like that. If at least for me, it seems very hard to constrain an AI in this goal framework that we currently have. Like we have machine learning always functions with, right now, most functions with objective functions that you just optimize, and then to find the right objective function, I think it's really hard if you make it really intelligent. I mean, for example, in a sense, you can for example see companies as AI, like corporations, because a corporation is usually more than one person, and then in that sense, it's more intelligent than one person. It's because it's a team of persons, and then also different structures and resources that they have, and they optimize for profit, and that already brings us a lot of problems if it's not constrained by law in a meaningful sense. And if we just increase intelligence there, which I think is the most likely path, we get problems with AI, even with narrow AI right now, that powerful corporations are optimizing narrow objective functions with highly intelligent algorithms, and that having side effects that can't be foreseen because we are not as smart as the things with which we optimize, right? So
that's kind of the interesting point. I mean, you can argue of how intelligent these algorithms are, but they are extremely effective in this narrow sense. I mean, it's been a long-standing story in AI that as soon as we find like a narrow application of AI, then the algorithm tends to just get much better than human beings instantly or with like a couple of months.
Mm-hmm. Like, and then we shift our notion of intelligence and say, okay, that's chess playing. That's not really intelligent. That's just pushing around pieces on a board. And what we mean is actually more something like Go, for example. Which is now,
and looking at a Facebook profile and knowing perfectly how to target them to vote for certain parties. That's just dumb. Everyone could do that.
Yeah. But I mean, that concern also is it's kind of irrelevant if we call that intelligence or not. If it's destructive for the world, then we need to do something about it.
No. I mean, I was being sarcastic. I don't know if that came
across.
But it's like if you think about what these algorithms do, then they don't only infer that from the Facebook profile, but they use millions of examples. Again, talking about that whole memory thing, the algorithm also stores information of millions of use cases very effectively in the network architecture of these classifiers, for example. And then that's very close to many things we do as human beings that are pretty impressive from an intelligence perspective. Like even like selecting applicants for a job, for example, that's precisely the same job that the Facebook algorithm does if it's optimizing like which people to show what kind of information. So
although the Facebook algorithm is probably better at that.
I mean, if you read Thinking Fast and Slow, the hiring algorithms aren't very effective as well. This interesting perspective that the human heuristics we have tend to be pretty bad, and as soon as we replace them with mathematical formulas, even like a simple linear predictor model of certain properties of an applicant, and Kahneman and Tversky talk about this for officers in the Israeli army, like selecting them and predicting how successful they are actually going to be. Basically, the human expert predictions were worse than like a linear model based on the objective facts, and probably even worse than a random model or something.
Yeah, I think that though. Yeah, that's a really useful avenue for research for making AI interpretable to actually make it simpler. Like right now we have these deep models, and in a sense, I mean, maybe they're better than humans, but maybe they're also not. Like for a specific application, they can also fall into that expert trap, I would say. That, for example, for Amazon had this project, I think, for selecting applicants and based on CVs, past CVs, and then they suddenly found that the AI was vastly predicting better results for male applicants, and that's just been the case because of I mean, in the past that has been the case. So basically, what the algorithm did was to infer from the past. I mean, it did exactly what we wanted to do, but just based on the data, which is the representation of the past, didn't apply anything in the future. And if you had a simpler model, where you could see each variable influencing the decision, then you could make that much more apparent from the beginning.
I think that's where like, some statistical notions come in so handy in AI, because you always should start with a linear regression, for example, and use like the simplest version as a baseline to see if all the fancy architecture you build on top is actually worth something. Maybe that's also where, the scientific spirit or scientific approach to research clashes a bit with the more engineering-based approaches, and for many machine learning AI developers, which are actually sitting at applications and they need to get working algorithms and they try things out, but it's not really about the transparency of the algorithm or keeping it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
And you could maybe even argue about this tendency of human beings to it always comes across as more impressive if you come up with like a sophisticated solution with many nice tweaks and turns, and if you just say this thing that then you cite a paper from 1972, they already did that and that works perfectly. Then people are starting to wonder why they hired you.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, for practical applications, that's going to be a problem for AI if we can't really understand what it does. But the nice book recommendation on that is the alignment problem. It's also talking about, for example, this medical example that I think it was some lung disease.
Was it COVID lungs or something?
And no, it was something. Some lung disease. I forgot what it was. And then basically they had asthma patients, and asthma was predicted to have a positive impact on this disease. And the reason for that, I mean, they stopped the program immediately. The reason for that was so doctors knew that couldn't be, like asthma is terrible, and the reason why it has a better outcome is actually because of, if the doctors see that someone has asthma, he gets specialized treatment, and then actually his outcome may be slightly better because of the danger of the disease. He gets such a special treatment. But if you just follow the recommendations by the AI, just blindly trained on the data, then we would predict that asthma, we don't need to do anything about it. It's great if you have asthma and some lung disease.
Perfect combination. Yeah.
Did you hear about the Lambda model, Google's recent language model? I mean, they have so many large language models these days. But the Lambda was a controversy about AI and the sentience. So that one engineer, a Google engineer, who got laid off immediately afterwards, claimed that this language model has become sentient or conscious, and that it needs to be taken care of, and it's kind of pointed to the moral implications of having a model and then treating it badly if it has some notion of will. And I mean, the dialogue is kind of impressive if you read it. It's I don't know what to think of it. I think it's still just producing text that's very coherent.
Yeah, that's
and
like the weird thing about the Turing test is that it's not a good test in many ways for intelligence, or definitely not for sentience, because you can even fake pretty decent versions of the Turing test with lookup tables and old-fashioned AI, and there's really no reason to assume that there's kind of the meat and bone or like the word model that is needed to integrate these texts into like a coherent framework of having a view of the world and having emotions. Nothing of that sort needs to be there for models to produce like proper text already. So there's this big gap between what the Turing test tests for and is the Turing test's ability to predict kind of sentience. But the issue is that it's like in practical terms, it's probably the most convincing to us and will play a big role in kind of robot-human interactions, because as soon as robots start to speak our language, you can see that with Alexa and Siri, we already start building up some kind of emotional feedback mechanisms and reactions to that. And the more sophisticated that language gets, the more convinced we are, even though the model is still lacking huge amounts of other necessary ingredients.
Yeah, I mean, although we never really know that, right? Like, there's this Chinese room argument, so that someone who can speak Chinese just looks up things and convinces, like, basically looks up in the dictionary and makes someone from the outside of the room think that this room knows Chinese, or the person in the room knows Chinese. What I find a bit weird about this argument is that in the end, I mean, the room knows Chinese, right? It's not the person inside, but the room and as a system as a whole knows Chinese. It's an argument against consciousness in artificial machines, so that the machine can seem conscious although it's not.
Yeah, I think the claim is more that I would claim more that you can implement knowing Chinese in different ways, and the human way is integrated in this affective framework. Also, relating to Mark Solms and his idea of kind of affect being at the center of consciousness, and can know Chinese effectively by having a body that reacts to words in certain ways and knows a Chinese word, or you can have a lookup table, which you already have on the internet, which basically knows Chinese, and you have DeepL, which can translate text pretty convincingly, but doesn't have a body. So that's what I mean. You can know language on different layers of the hierarchy, and one of them leads to sentience, but the text itself doesn't.
Yeah, although, I mean, like, if we divorce like sentience from consciousness in this instance, we can't really claim that, okay, this maybe sounds a bit crazy, but we can't really claim that the room is not conscious, the Chinese room. Or that the lookup table is not conscious. It's like consciousness itself is just, I don't know if you should even start that discussion, because it's just, you can't claim much about consciousness. You cannot even know if I'm conscious. I mean, I seem to be, maybe, but if I'm conscious or not, only I know. With this,
but again,
Although the only thing I wanted to ask you about this zombie argument, like, one thing I don't really understand about this is, if you assume like I'm a zombie, then me talking about consciousness and like being interested in it and seeming to know what it is, isn't that some kind of proof that I'm conscious?
I mean, it's a proof of the meme of consciousness being caught up in our language and our scientific discussion.
But why would we come up with this meme in the first place if it's
So I have a bit of a.
I mean, of course, if you ask these language models, are you conscious, then they will answer yes, and that doesn't mean anything necessarily. But
I have a bit of a hypothesis. Chalmers talks about this meta problem of consciousness. So why are we actually so obsessed with this idea of there being consciousness in the first place? And I think it relates to like consciousness from that, more underlying perspective of it makes us like the divine spark, or whatever you want to call it, also tied up in our Christian conception of the world, and also connected to free will, which is also like specifically connected to our metaphysical view of the world and the Western world, which is very different from many other tribal conceptions or in other cultures conceptions of free will, because our moral institutions basically rest on that.
And the notion of free will.
On this notion of free will, which is also connected to the notion of a monotheistic God, which can basically see all of our actions, but gave us free will in order for us to decide for good or evil, which is a very Christian metaphysical conception of that. And in that framework, free will becomes such a central moral instance because it's basically the divine task for us to live a good life.
And then that's connected to our interest in consciousness.
Yeah, definitely in kind of this agency perspective and this idea that consciousness is we are aware of what we do, and maybe also like a metacognition aspect to it. But this is...
Yeah, interesting. I would argue that the most sophisticated notion of consciousness is found not in Christianity, but in Buddhism. Yeah. And also this whole notion of free will is actually more annoying and more confusing, I think, and I think it's an illusion, and connected to the illusion of self, and that kind of confuses our thinking of what consciousness is. Because in us, it's very closely related to the self. Like we think like we are an agent. We make choices, and that's what consciousness means for us. But then if you take like a drug that reliably releases this notion of self, then you can also you can divorce that the conscious experience from the experience of self.
And you can reliably experience you not having free will. But that's why it's so interesting that we have that clash between free will and like scientific deterministic notions of the world, but we keep holding on to that, or most people keep holding on to that. And me, myself, when I think about my actions, also in some way hold on to that notion of there being some kind of free will, because it's so tied up with our moral perception of the world and our justice system and all of that.
I mean, in society, but also in evolutionary speaking, like this notion of self, and like probably also in just in the interrelational sense that you need to explain yourself to others, otherwise you're weird and unexplainable and dangerous. So you need to have like a concept of self, and to deflect blame from yourself. That's very useful, and if you live together in groups.
Yeah, I think that's another very fascinating, weird question in terms of like how we build AI systems that could potentially be sentient, because we are evolutionarily forced to have a coherent self model, or at least trying to make it as coherent as possible, because we are this embodied agent which have one face and walk around in the world, kind of having to project that coherent worldview. But if you just have an algorithm that's running, I don't know if it necessarily comes up with this kind of binding structure of I am that one sentient thing.
Yeah, maybe not. I mean, if you have it in a reinforcement learning setting, then maybe that notion emerges on itself. Like if you have an agent running in a maze, then the position will be very relevant. So this concept of self maybe comes through sensory experience. But I mean, if you have an algorithm optimizing, user recommendations for Facebook, then that may be completely useless and be just not in the algorithm. So the algorithm wouldn't have the concept of self. Yeah, it's weird to think about that, how that would feel. I mean, do you think the current algorithms are conscious?
Yeah, that really depends on your perception or like definition of consciousness.
I mean, we should also we should first define what we mean by consciousness. I mean, I would go with this notion of like what does it feel like to be something, some process. Like how does it feel like to be a bat? Like Thomas Nagel definition. I think that's the most useful one, and it's not connected to self and awareness and other things.
Yeah, I think after having Mark Solms on and reading his book and thinking about affect, that perspective has shifted a little bit for me, and I still am somewhat convinced by his arguments that there are like more deeply rooted mechanisms at work than simply the cortical kind of metacognitive aspects of thinking about ourselves and thinking about thinking and these kind of things, but it's more this visceral kind of feeling of how am I in the world and how is my homeostasis holding up and what are kind of these essential components of how my body is doing in the world.
Yeah, I think so. For me personally, as coming from physics, the only perspective that kind of makes sense to me is this sounds kind of crazy, but this panpsychism. It's a really bad name, I think. It sounds like somewhat metaphysical, although it's exactly the opposite. It's basically the most physical view that every physical process has some subjective nature to it. And I think the niceness of that view is that you don't need to. There's no boundary. I mean, the boundary can be super gradual. Like, otherwise, you always think like, okay, what? So humans may be conscious, and then apes also, and other animals. But then, what about an ant? And what about a simple reinforcement? What about a simple reinforcement learning agent in a maze or something? And then what about some stupid algorithm that's even worse than that, or even simpler than that? So,
yeah.
But I think the relevant aspect of consciousness for morals, is suffering, right? So that I think comes in with homeostasis, maybe, and that would be very early, right? Like that would be bacteria level, where our morals would extend to bacteria in that sense.
I think that's a very important distinction, is that not all consciousness necessarily has the ability to suffer. And again, that's what I also wanted to connect that to earlier. That's why consciousness is so crucial, because we see in others like the ability to suffer and in ourselves the ability to suffer. And that's why it's so tied up to these moral notions of the world.
It of course depends on what's your moral framework, what's important, but I mean suffering is kind of among the moral frameworks that you can construct. It's in this Bayesian way of thinking about, like, if you integrate over all these moral frameworks that you can possibly have, and which ones are more likely to be true, kind of, then suffering is very important, I think.
Yeah, in Buddhism, it's at the core of everything.
Yeah. So you want to avoid suffering. It's very easy for us to say, like, I want to avoid suffering, right? And then you can assume that for someone else, and that's already where ethics starts. You extend your own, how you want to be treated yourself. You want every creature or thing to be treated.
Yeah, I had Jasper Götting from EA circles on the podcast before, and we also talked about this kind of contentious topic of animal suffering and wildlife suffering, which is like basically that notion of, we think they're suffering in nature, and do we have a moral responsibility to take care of that, or to?
Yeah, that's a very, it's a kind of a constructed example. We take care of that already by extinguishing wildlife, so it's
it's our moral duty.
That's why we do it.
Thank the oil companies.
But what we replace it with is like animals bound up into these meat factories. So it's not. I don't think it's moral reasons why we do it. It's safe to say.
Yeah, that's pretty sure.
Yeah, I don't know. What do you think about it? I would say under this moral framework under a moral framework constructed from suffering, that's the logical conclusion. But it's counterintuitive, of course.
Yeah, and it leads kind of. I think it really connects to this basic notion of how optimistic we should be about life and reality and the universe. And if kind of the natural state that came out of evolution was one of suffering for most living things that came about on Earth, kind of induces this more pessimistic notion. I think you already have traces of that. You have Janaism I think that's what it's called in ancient India, where people basically tried not to
step on an ant,
step on anything and just try to lie in a corner until they died, because life was so just vehicle for suffering, and that's why you couldn't live anymore. So I think just projecting that metaphysical notion onto life, and then thinking, all animals, it would be better if nothing existed. I think that kind of,
well, that's a different claim, right? Like you say, like existence is worse than non-existence. I mean, maybe that life is full of suffering, but it's still worth it for some other reason.
Yeah.
I mean, of course not if you only have the dimension of suffering, then non-existence. Or I mean, I wouldn't even know where non-existence is. Is it zero? Is it? It's not really defined, right? It's kind of like a high-dimensional space. Each individual being one dimension, and then each dimension can be either like suffering and less suffering, and then if non-existence is like the space doesn't exist at all, so there's no metric you can define to compare these spaces.
Yeah. But it's so difficult to define like the positive direction in animal wildlife suffering. It's hard for us to estimate how important is like the joy of a deer running around in the forest. That it's very hard to make these judgments. So I think at that point, I can understand the point better, that human beings should just maybe start taking care of themselves and kind of leave nature as it is. But it's, again, if you want to be...
Yeah, the problem is if you take any moral system and optimize it, and it's kind of similar to like if you take any objective and optimize with an AI, the what comes out of it is very, very clear-cut answers. Like if you say like more humans are better than less humans, right? Like there's more experience, more pleasure, and if you say like existence is better than non-existence, then like each additional human would be better. Then the conclusion would be if you value like life as such and nature, and then say, okay, it's better to have more humans here, and then just cut down the rainforest, make some artificial carbon capture to stabilize the climate, and then somehow farm field it to, if that was possible, even for sustainable. I don't think it is, but anyway, let's assume it is, and then that would be better to have more humans living on Earth. But I think it's important, like with all this, what's kind of also, again, connecting to this AI safety, that there's this strand of introducing uncertainty into the AI's objective, that you don't really know your objective for sure, and then you can kind of come out of it. So in this moral framework, it would be that you don't really know if you have the right morals, and so you have to kind of make a Bayesian integrate over all possible morals, and then make your actions more conservative. So you can't go too extreme then, because that would violate, maybe if under one moral framework that would be the best, but under others it wouldn't be, and then you have to be more careful.
So you have an ensemble over moral positions active, and you randomly select.
Yeah.
Like for every decision you take in your life, you do like a weighted sum of actions.
I think that's a huge bias. Oh, maybe not bias, but it's a huge prior towards more conservative actions. Like leave everything as it is more. First, do no harm, kind of like that.
One of the great also topics I've been thinking about a lot recently, because noise pops up everywhere in the algorithms we develop, like in a variational inference framework and in Bayesian frameworks, you very frequently have these uncertainty estimates, and in the free energy principle as well. This is like one of the crucial components of actually estimating the uncertainty in a system before we take actions and before we try to infer how relevant it is to actually make predictions in these environments. If we have an extremely noisy environment, then it doesn't make sense to make any predictions there, because they are going to be terrible anyway, or not lead to too much good anyway. And as you just mentioned, conservative action, also from the perspective of government, if you have like central planning governments versus markets. In central planning, you do one thing and you do it top down. There's basically no noise in your decision. But in markets, in the best case, you have like a distribution over different actions that are taken with like different levels of confidence and certainty, or not making like a capitalism communism comparison per se, but in a more general sense, central planning can also, like, you can do that with your own life. Basically, you can central plan your life, or you can inject some noise and uncertainty. And there's, I think, a good case to be made that in uncertain environments and noisy environments, injecting that noise into your decision making can actually help you make better decisions.
Although for the markets, it's also because there's so many more preferences to be like the markets function by valuing each individual's preferences, and that's kind of an ensemble method, because some individuals like other things than others, and if you have a central planner, you just have to decide for one thing, and that can lead to it's kind of having like one objective function and versus having many objective functions. Like if you have all the humans collectively, they have like a multitude of objective functions. But it may be also about noise. Yeah, that's true.
Maybe we can connect that to your current paper, actually, because you pursue a somewhat similar idea with these multiple reservoir computing. Maybe we can just start with the technicalities if you're interested in switching gears a little bit and talking about that.
Yeah. So sure. My most recent paper was on continual learning of dynamical systems. So if a system changes, to still recollect the dynamical system behavior of the past system, but also be able to predict in the current system, or as I called it, in the current environment. So the environment might change, and then you still want to predict over. You want to collect the memory of all environments that you encounter. And for dynamical systems, reservoir computing is a very useful approach. Maybe I should explain that first. Reservoir computing is basically saying you just randomly initialize a recurrent neural network, and so you just it's to be initialized, not completely randomly, but to be somewhat stable and obey like certain conditions. But you initialize it and then fix it, and don't change it. So usually in recurrent neural network training, you could, for example, train with backpropagation through time and update all the weights in this network with respect to a certain objective. But in reservoir computing, you fix the network except for a linear output layer that is trained. And since it's linear, you can train it via old school linear regression, or in that case, it was like some regularized version of linear regression. And that's so much faster than backpropagating through time. So that's really useful. And in general, reservoir computing is, originally it came from the times where we didn't have the computational resources to do a backpropagation through time, and it also didn't have the certain tricks to make it work. And so that was kind of a way around that. But for dynamical systems, it works really well. Also today, it's kind of among state-of-the-art methods, and that's one reason to choose it in this dynamical continual learning for dynamical systems setting. And the other reason is the other motivation is that for continual learning, you have this stability plasticity dilemma that you so when the distribution changes, you want to adjust to the new distribution or environment, but at the same time remember the old, and so you want to be plastic enough to change, but stable enough to not forget the old. And that's a problem often. If you just naively train a recurrent neural network and switch the tasks, then you will catastrophically forget everything that you learned before. So your network is trained on task 1, and then task 2 training, it forgets everything trained on task 1. And so from that perspective, reservoir computing is nice because fixed weights can't forget. Of course. And so then the only question is how do you deal with this change? Like if you train one linear output head, how do you train if you encounter a new environment? And in the paper we had the predictive coding approach, where we basically determined by the performance. We had like an ensemble of reservoirs and randomly initialized and of reservoir heads, and then the most predictive one was updated. And we also changed took a method from federated learning to do that iteratively, because usually you would optimize reservoirs one shot, basically. It's linear regression, and there you have multiple updates.
Maybe to connect that to like neuroscientific intuitions, and also what Buzaki talks about with this idea of in the brain being a somewhat similar structure. So this reservoir is basically a reservoir of dynamics, which can, maybe you can imagine just as a box of 10,000 neurons firing in certain ways, and you're trying to extract the firing pattern of the neurons that's most relevant to explaining the dynamics you observe in your data, for example. Buzaki claims that the brain basically also already comes with this a dynamical reservoir that is not really learned, but is kind of already stable, in the same way that we initialize a machine learning algorithm to be stable at the beginning, and then don't try to fix it or don't try to change it too much. But then we can just train readout heads basically on this dynamic, and these readouts, for example, correspond to useful cognitive things. They can, like, depending on which brain area you look at, it can be like memories of certain sequences, or memories or action sequences or motor movements.
Yeah, so Buzaki claims that the hippocampus acts as a sequence generator, mainly like the theta frequency band background. Sorry, still recovering from COVID. The frequency of the theta band is kind of the background rhythm of the brain, and then the everything we encounter is encoded onto these sequences and mapped onto these sequences.
Yeah, the argument in the brain is, or at least many features of learning in the brain are hard to replicate as of yet in AI systems. For example, this catastrophic forgetting we encounter quite frequently. And if we approach maybe even AI in general, or if we try to get to more realistic models of the brain, then the dynamical components will become increasingly difficult, because the brain works so incredibly differently just in its physical implementation. We have neural rhythms, and we have like neural assemblies forming that encode some kind of cognitive process that is so different from what a computer implements. And maybe this is something we will never. I mean, there's also an interesting question if like a true AGI will come because we build a computer that works like the brain, or if we just manage to abstract like the core principles of what the brain is doing.
Yeah, it's often compared to this like plane analogy, like birds and planes. And so we don't need to know how exactly the bird flies in order to make planes. We just need to understand the principles. But I mean, for the brain, we don't understand yet what are the important principles and what level of detail and granularity is actually required.
But it's interesting to pick out certain like problems in AI, like catastrophic forgetting and continual learning, and try to think of algorithmic solutions and kind of compare them to how we think the brain is actually solving these problems.
Yeah, and most actually in the continual learning space, most methods can be clustered into all somewhat brain-inspired algorithms. So there's replay-based algorithms which can be connected to hippocampal replay and the complementary learning system of like hippocampus and neocortex. So that throughout the day you store rapidly episodic memories onto the hippocampus, and throughout the night in sleep, that's the complementary learning systems theory that then gets integrated into your broader semantic knowledge of the neocortex. And that may be the reason why replay is so effective. So our replay-based methods.
I think this also connects to other interesting things in the AI space and the general points of generative models. Also, I was thinking of the wake-sleep algorithm and the Helmholtz machines and how they connect to ideas like variational inference, where you build generative models of the data, which then allows you to replay not only the data you encounter, but also like generate new data that follows like a similar distribution. So these statistical models of not only time series, but also of all kinds of sensory input also play like a very interesting role, and they also connect to this notion of uncertainty. Maybe we can talk about these as well.
Well, first I want to know is that just say that like training generative models in the context of replay is also something that's been explored already. Like there's this notion of generative replay where you train the model to sample such that you don't have to memorize or basically write to memory exact samples. That's something that's I mean it's kind of doesn't feel right, basically, to just use the computer to just store sensory input as such, but we want to do something with it and store it in a nicer way.
Interesting point in dynamical systems reconstruction, which is like the optimal compression algorithm. You store the entire sequence in like from the Markov chain perspective, or like in first order Markov model, you just have one model and you only need the initial state and you have everything else. It's like the perfect compression.
Yeah. I mean, that's in general the compression. You can see AI or like learning in general as compression.
Yeah.
Like, I think I heard a podcast from Jürgen Schmidt-Huber who had this idea that the universe is like the fundamental formula is very simple, and then everything emerges out of that, and intelligence is to be able to compress it again to find the simple laws that govern.
Also similar to what Wolfram is attempting, at least with his theory of everything.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice to have the theory of everything. Although it's important to note that wouldn't give us everything.
Yeah.
Like, because of the emergent nature of everything we have. Like you can't predict all the phenomena of, for example, quantum mechanics. Like us, for example, also just purely looking at the Schrödinger equation. Like these equations, I mean, you can look at them, but you have to actually run them to know what comes out. And you can't know. Maybe you can't know before you actually run them.
And that's also
because they're so compressed. Precisely.
Yeah, it's like this notion of computational irreducibility, that if you have, for example, a chaotic system, you can't make a better prediction than by just running it forward in time. So you can only predict the Lorentz for 1,000 time steps by running the Lorentz for 1,000 time steps. So you don't have a more efficient representation of this prediction in the system itself. That could be very well true for our lives and maybe like the world, because it's so complex and intertwined that minute changes will so dramatically shift the outcome. And that's the whole butterfly effect notion of small changes blowing up to huge differences, and then you can't really reduce it anymore, even though the basic formalism or the basic method might be simple.
Yeah, you basically can only trade off computation against memory. Like either you store the whole sequence of the Lorentz and then you know everything, or you store the formula, which might not need as much memory, but then you need to perform the computation in order to get the result.
Yeah, and that's also a cool perspective on what science is, or what brain also does. Like, remember what we can like reduce properly, but you remember things much more effectively if you can integrate them into some kind of framework.
Yeah, that's true. You won't always have to connect it to something you know already. Otherwise, it's like you don't. That's the difference to just the classical computer that just can store anything and as atomic facts, and that's fine.
Yeah, maybe also going back to these models that contain some kind of uncertainty, like variational autoencoders.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, they also obviously compress the data, and I don't know. I'm sometimes skeptical about the notion of uncertainty in variational autoencoders. If that's maybe only a computational trick, kind of to perform the optimization, or if that's really representing uncertainty. But anyways, I mean, also like normal autoencoders, they work. Yeah, they build up representations by compression. So you predict a latent code that is much lower dimensional than your input, and because it's so low dimensional, the model has to efficiently compress it in order to reconstruct that initial input again.
Yeah, so it's we recently played around with LSTMs again, and there was this hyperparameter in the code, and like the main difference in performance was based on how much noise you injected, and it just got better when you injected more noise. That was like,
oh, that's so interesting.
And it's like even in algorithms that don't really contain that by design, that are trained deterministically, just injecting noise. Also with the teacher forcing that we are currently using, it helps in so many places that this is actually quite fascinating. Probably because like also this trade-off between, from that perspective of what you mentioned earlier, you have several hypotheses, and these are represented as kind of optimal solutions in your loss landscape or something. And then if you inject noise, you don't run the risk of over inferring like one explanation.
Yeah, it's kind of a regularizer, right? I mean, it's regularizing you're making certain very, very specific models unlikely, because then a small amount of noise would just destroy the model.
Yeah.
Also similar to, you can see like dropout, like having as an ensemble method, and also as a noise, essentially, like dropping out certain units randomly, and that's also there's this duality between ensemble methods and noise. Like you can treat you can exchange that against
it's
each other.
Essentially the idea of noise on model parameters or something basically induces like a probability distribution over them. Also going back to this Bayesian framework, you don't have one explanation, but you have like a most likely explanation, but you also have several explanations at the same time.
Yeah, and I mean, in machine learning, it comes in already with stochastic gradient descent. That works much better than, even though it's also more computationally efficient, but it's also works just better than the complete gradient descent.
Could quickly go into how that actually works, or what the stochastic part of gradient descent is.
Yeah. So if you have a complete like data set, you can, and you want to optimize your algorithm with respect to that data set to a certain objective, then you can do that in a gradient-based manner by going into a step into the correct direction under the objective. And so you could do that in principle over the whole data set, and then to calculate the gradient with respect to like averaged over the complete set of data points. I mean, for the data sets that we typically have, that's infeasible. They're just too big. But also, it's so that's one reason why we would choose like a small subset of the data. But also, if you choose a small subset of the data randomly and do the gradient update, then that adds stochasticity, and for the reasons we just mentioned, that could be beneficial as a regularizer.
Yeah, I've just been wondering if there's anything to learn for human beings from this insight. Maybe like
from this. You mean like for the neuroscience or for us?
No, like not for us. Like, how do we regularize our decision making in our life, or like, do we inject that noise?
Yeah, it's kind of. I think the failure of like the really catastrophic failures of humans collectively have always been very specific ideologies, right? Like if that's been connected to the most egregious suffering in human history, and that's also a very specific set of morals. I mean, it's also because it's the wrong morals often, but I mean, how do you find the right morals? If like, let's take communism, because I mean, like fascism is already like in the morals itself. You can say, okay, that's just stupid. That doesn't make sense. Like that's how we see it nowadays. But communism has kind of this appeal of maybe the theory was somewhat. In theory, they wanted something good, right? And then just it turns out to be implemented badly or something. But yeah, maybe it's just because the theory is also so specific, and yeah, maybe you can. Yeah, noise. I mean, in human decisions, you would inject noise by being more humble, I guess, about what you know and what you don't know, and if you to be more aware of what you don't know, it's can be kind of
good metacognition. What you kind of said with communism, that because what you said earlier with companies being like these kind of superhuman AI systems already, I find that with these failed totalitarian states, or this like the Soviet Union under Stalin, or even afterwards, is such a great example of the alignment problem. Now that we've talked about it in this slide, because you have this communism as this ideology, as like a set of goals, and you want to achieve this communist utopia. But then the way the state as a superhuman organism implements that, and everyone is suffering, like the political elite is suffering because they are all getting shot
even
every 2
Stalin
years.
Is suffering, and in the end,
everyone is suffering because you have a misaligned kind of like implemented that in this superhuman machine where everyone is watching everyone and no one has the freedom to say, let's stop.
That's true. I mean, I mean, corporations is the modern implementation of superhuman AI, but you can also have this state systems. You can see governments as such a superhuman AI, and that there's kind of really, really powerful control mechanism that leads to suffering on all levels. That's true.
Yeah, and they usually, like on the state leader level, they don't inject a lot of noise. I mean, that's what people say about Putin now. He has no critical voice around him anymore. He basically has this one worldview of what he wants to achieve, and not even the Secret Service they are not courageous enough to tell him basically the truth about what is happening. Or at least that's what some people claim is happening.
Yeah, I mean, the only noise would come from, and that's so far been the downfall of systems like these, is like that at some point the leader just dies, and then the system is collapsing, or it doesn't know how to deal with it. Like democracies, in democracies, we figured out the way of transition of power, and that's really the biggest strength, I would say, of democracies. Because you could argue like, okay, systems, autocratic systems may be more efficient in certain ways, but yeah, transition of power is a huge problem for these types of systems. And yeah, also the individual that's on top, if it has a very specific view of the world and imposes that on, yeah, I don't think we need to argue that that's bad. Yeah.
Yeah, hasn't worked so well historically.
No, but that's also because I mean, Plato would say that it's just because of the type of individual that comes out on top. It's usually psychopaths that go up the food chain.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't managed to select like a mechanism that doesn't select for these kind of people.
Yeah, that's okay. That's just kind of a meta problem that we have in humanity. How we deal with antisocial behavior, and if we can somehow deselect this, like maybe even genetically, but I mean, this is probably not up for discussion in ours. But somehow, how do we deal with this? And I think we will develop methods of detecting, or we already know, like from brain scans, we can already detect antisocial behavior disorder or like psychopathy. And do we want this in certain positions? I think you could argue that we don't want psychopaths, like in positions of power, of responsibility. Maybe we don't want it. Although right now, in like the CIA estimates, I think that 40% of the CEOs in the US are psychopaths. So it's kind of difficult to also implement these changes if the leading figures are all psychopaths.
Yeah, the psychopaths are not going to implement these changes. Yeah.
But it's also, do you know this conspiracy theory of reptiles reigning the world?
Like Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney.
Yeah, so I don't know any specifics about that, but I just find it interesting because, I mean, the reptile brain is kind of a psychopathic brain, right? And so I can see how people start believing this.
There's like this cold look in their eyes, like from reptiles. I think that I'm still not sure if this theory actually came about as a joke or if
I don't know. I just saw it through South Park, so that's my source.
That's what educates. Yeah, there's this brilliant radio interview where Donald Rumsfeld is calling in, and it's on the Opie and Anthony show, and Louis C.K. is present, and then Louis C.K. asks Donald Rumsfeld if he's a reptile as a joke. But then he, like a true politician, really avoids answering the question.
Oh my God.
And then for the next 15 minutes, Louis C.K. just keeps on asking him and making like it's absolutely brilliant.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, now with Hillary Clinton, you have that as well. And I think it kind of transitioned into QAnon, this like child molester ring around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think conspiracy theories, they kind of co-occur. Like if you have one, if you disbelieve in one conspiracy, then you just start believing the next one, I guess. But I find it really difficult to how should we treat conspiracy theories, because I also don't like the way to just say, or to just label something a conspiracy theory doesn't make it untrue.
Yeah,
because there is conspiracies in the world, and sometimes
there's so many,
and oftentimes that has led to them being uncovered, that people started talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we shouldn't just blend. Yeah, it's very difficult because there's the society has this consensus of what's right and wrong, but I think it's also what disturbs me about it, that we don't have allow for enough noise there, that we need to have some level of divergent thinking in our society in order to be stable and not enforce too much convergence to this one view of what's right and wrong.
Yeah, I think we failed spectacularly during COVID to
definitely
like have a sensible discussion, like from both sides. I think there were so many faults made so that basically all meaningful conversation was killed, and it was almost like some of the COVID measures were like a double down of showing that you were pro-COVID measures and pro-vaccines, and all the vaccine people started behaving irrationally about
it was pure, it was totally tribal and stupid, and not very nuanced on both sides. And I'm just very glad that, I mean, COVID is not over, but like this whole the stress of COVID is the most stressful phase, I think, is over. Now, hopefully, our society is somewhat relaxed from that.
Yeah. Now we have some wars going on, but
the future future looks grim, anyways. But I mean, it's sometimes difficult for me also to think about, like, personally, how do I want to live my life in light of, I mean, climate change is one thing where you can think, okay, and I really need to think in 10 years, summers are maybe not as enjoyable anymore, and maybe I need to move up north somehow. But also, like, AI security, I mean, this could come in the next, could come in 10 years. We don't really know. And if that's really the end of the world, then it makes sense to, I guess it always makes sense to enjoy life.
We also wanted to talk about dopamine. I was looking for the right place to jump in, maybe talking about enjoying life and pursuing meaningful things. Dopamine is like a cool way of coming in here, but also connecting to AI algorithms and recommendations we get and addictions to social media and other things.
We both read Dopamine Nation, a great book on dopamine. And the central insight for me was that, dopamine has this dual role and subjectively is associated with pleasure. But for its absence, it's associated with pain. And so if we pursue pleasure in the dopamine sense of pleasure, which we can distinguish from, like, well-being in general and other hormones, I think are far more worth to pursue. But if we pursue, like, the pleasurable things, like eating chocolate or other addictive substances, then that comes at a cost of because of homeostasis. So the body, if you can envision it like a scale, and if you tip that scale towards pleasure, then the body really tries to, or the brain really tries to tip that balance back into the equal, so that you, when you then relieve that pleasurable stimulus, that you tip over into pain. And that's the basis of addiction, that you want to pursue pleasure, but also a lot of addiction is basically avoid pain. And that's also why people become addicted more easily if they have some sort of pain in their lives. I think this is kind of maybe the origin of suffering. This kind of that's really where suffering begins. So that would begin in bacteria already. They pursue homeostasis.
Yeah,
but that
I mean, especially especially in the dopaminergic sense in the human brain, this dopaminergic kind of pursuit of pleasure is always tied up to that scale of you can't really feel that dopaminergic high for a long time without getting hit back by life, for example.
Yeah, and you always readjust. Like, I mean, we all know that from experience. Like, if you will, or we know that from stories, like, of people winning the lottery. After a couple of days, they feel the same as someone who's lost a leg. And initially, that feels much worse, of course. But you homeostatically adjust, and life just goes on.
I mean, it's quite interesting. I think from the reverse perspective, that's much more interesting than the kind of obvious conclusion. Yeah, you can't always be happy, but integrating like some some well-selected suffering into your life can actually make your pleasureful moments much better. I mean, there's even
or pain. I mean, you can feel pain without suffering, right?
Exactly.
So that's really what you want.
And that's why a lot of things like heavy workouts and now cold exposure is so popular with Wim Hof methods, and also shown to increase dopamine levels quite sustainably for some time. If you actually feel real strong physical discomfort, then you have like not eating, you have kind of fasting regimes, which also give you this physical discomfort.
Or like acupuncture is hypothesized to work like that you have small pain to relieve a big pain. It's very useful to think of the scale. Also, like, how do you avoid becoming addicted to something, and how do you reevaluate your goals in life? Is it really worth to pursue something? If how long will that pleasure last?
Yeah, and from the, I mean, I think one interesting insight about dopamine is also that you need to kind of schedule how much. Like dopamine is about pursuing a goal and not about achieving a goal. So once you achieve a goal, you don't really get any additional reward for that. So that can be quite tricky sometimes to deal with these kind of feelings of emptiness after achieving a certain goal. And it's so interesting. Like now with paper publications, I didn't feel any pleasure. like
because you already expected it, right?
Yeah. Because
you kind of have, if you expect it already, then you.
The only pleasure I felt when I got like the mail that it was accepted, when I was thinking it wouldn't get accepted, then there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of dopamine. But now, like finishing it up and doing all the work for 2 months to get the version ready, that didn't change anything. And you also don't feel any pleasure from that. Any dopamine.
Maybe that's pleasure. Except if you reenact it. I mean, I find gratitude, like this notion of like gratitude, really useful, because you basically reevaluate your life and rethink about like all the nice things you have, for example, that you take for granted otherwise.
Yeah, that's a very non-dopaminergic activity.
That's true. I mean, in general, I would say like you should not strive for dope. I mean, it's kind of paradoxical, because dopamine is the thing that makes you strive for anything. Yeah. So you can't actually strive for anything without dopamine.
Yeah. So just don't strive. It's very Buddhist.
Yeah. That's the paradox of Buddhism. How do you strive for not striving?
Yeah, it's funny because people also make a competition out of meditating, and like next time I want to achieve this very special meditative theta wave vibrations.
Yeah, I'm constantly that annoys me the most while meditating, thinking of, okay, now I'm into the zone, and then this thought alone brings you out of the zone again, and like that's not your goal in the first place, to be in the zone.
I think understanding dopamine is really so important for understanding so many aspects also of, like, not in a scientific sense only, but about your own life. It's also The Molecule of More. It's also a great book on dopamine.
Yeah. And if we just go with the hypothesis of dopamine and like this homeostasis being the origin of suffering, then that would lead to the conclusion that we already create suffering in the reinforcement learning agents that we train, because they have certain goals and want to achieve something, and then if they can't give you the right Facebook recommendation and you switch to another site, then this algorithm is actually suffering. And so it's kind of that sounds really gloomy again. That would be kind of either it makes the people suffer for staying too long on social media and wasting their time, or it makes the algorithm suffer. Who's more morally important there?
Yeah, I've had this kind of nightmarish vision of if it's really homeostasis, and if it's like a one-dimensional like balance, if you just shift it in one direction, then every loss function that we use in machine learning basically is also that. And
yeah, it's not only reinforcement learning.
Like how many CPUs we forced to grind down the same Lawrence 96 simulations.
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to disconnect from that because it's so unlike everything we humans do, and it's very easy to say, okay, it's not relevant because it's not human suffering. But yeah, if you from first principles think about it, although I think most people would disagree with that notion of conscious and suffering and morals. But that doesn't mean it's not true.
And
I mean,
it's,
that's just,
again, if it's not worth thinking about that in that specific application, it's going to be relevant in our lifetime. I mean, depending on how long we live until something blows up. But I think it's fair to assume that we are going to have very strong AI algorithms in the next 50 years. I think no one is really doubting that.
Yeah. There's this tool online where you can have actually a vote on certain
median
timelines.
Is 20 years, so I mean, it doesn't mean that the whole field can't be biased, but
that would also then raise questions of like, how do we value this, what we create then, if it's far more complex than us? That's also the case already for this Lambda model. Like if it's a super sophisticated language model and just very, very complex, then is it worth more than us? In the same sense that then we are worth more than ants, maybe, or bugs. And I guess we will just stick to humans, but probably like that's what will happen. But like just from a first principle moral view, that maybe we have to give over to our AI overlords at some point.
I mean, I think we are biased towards moral systems that have us at the crowning achievement of reality. So I think most people will.
Yeah, unless we merge with AI and create like humanoid robots or like androids, like mixtures of smartphones.
Like semi-merged 4 hours per day.
Yeah, enlarging our sense of suffering.
Yeah, for sure. So I see we are closing in on the 2-hour mark, so maybe we can finish off by some. One question I really like to ask is for book recommendations, and I know you always have a lot of great books lying around.
I think we mentioned many of them, like Kusaki's The Brain from Inside Out, Dopamine Nation on dopamine. I really like the alignment problem by what was his name, Brian Christian or something like that. He also wrote a great book on like algorithms to live by. Also great book. Yeah, it's the same person, so I can highly recommend the alignment problems. It's same clarity and technical depth, and I could recommend more. It's just that's the ones I think that are mainly relevant for the podcast. And on AI safety, also I would say like Super Intelligence by Nick Bostrom is kind of a classic. And currently reading, you read this already. I haven't. The Strange Order of Things by Damasio on homeostasis.
Yeah, that also connects to Mark Solm's The Hidden Spring. It's called The Hidden Spring.
I have consciousness. I recently read the Anneka Harris, the book Conscious. It's very short, just a nice walk through consciousness. Also goes into this panpsychism.
It's also a topic that doesn't really get boring, but you also never feel like you learn anything. That's at least what it is.
No, it's just very hard. The hard problem of consciousness is maybe even unsolvable. Who knows? But there's different opinions on that. Some people think they can solve it. But I think in the end, what we may have is some sort of. I think how we can get further is maybe some ensemble of theories of consciousness, and that already because consciousness is at the cornerstone of our moral frameworks. So we need to think about like somehow make some assumptions about it. Otherwise, we don't get anywhere. We don't know what to do in the world. If we don't know that if you say like people in Africa, they're not conscious, they're not suffering, then that doesn't lead us to action there. I mean, that's very, like, of course, it's very obvious, but like, what about animals suffering, for example? Or, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we've hit the 2-hour mark. I know if you have anything to say, but
I feel really honored to be on your podcast, especially, again, how many great people you've been interviewing so far.
I mean, you're at the origin of many of my ideas and books, and so I thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, no worries.